Welcome to the Blue Security Podcast, a weekly podcast for information security defenders, where we bring you discussions on best practices, tools, and implementation for enterprise security. Now, here are your hosts for today's show, Andy Jha and Adam Brewer.
Welcome to another episode of the Blue Security Podcast. I'm Andy, your host.
I'm Adam, your co-host.
So this week, I wanted to do a breakdown of an update on the LastPass Incident. There were some news articles that were released that LastPass had updated their blog and done a forensic investigation. Adam saw the news and wasn't able to read all of it, and maybe some of you weren't able to read all of it. I read through the entirety of the blogs and the deep dive on everything that they've done and how the threat actors got in. So I wanted to chat about it because I think there's a lot that you can learn. And the way that they got in is probably a vulnerability at many companies. So it doesn't forgive what happened because I think the security was laxed. However, hopefully, as we all do in the security industry, we can learn from other people's mistakes, hopefully not replicate them, and harden our own environments to prevent this from happening.
Mm-hmm.
So the first incident, there were actually two of them. The first incident started on August 8th and lasted until August 12th of 2022, so last year. And what happened was they saw some behavior and access inconsistencies with a specific LastPass software engineering employee who had access to developmental resources. What they determined was, with the help of Mandiant, who was their partner in this investigation, that the software engineer's corporate laptop had been compromised, and that allowed the threat actor to have access to resources that the engineer legitimately had access to because it was on a corp laptop. Now, due to some anti-forensic activity, which means that the threat actor actually deleted some logs and deleted some system artifacts, they're actually not able to determine how the threat actor got into the SE's laptop, which is unfortunate, but they do know that the laptop was configured with their standard build, applications, utilities, and security controls. They also do know that there was an EDR agent installed. However, it was tampered with and it was not triggered during the initial activity. So I think that's important because I don't know what EDR agent they're using, but I do know that one of the things that is important for EDR agents is that tamper protection is enabled. Not all EDR solutions have this, but I know that at least for Microsoft, we do have something called tamper protection. We did an entire episode deep dive on it because it is now turned on by default for anyone who's deploying Defender for Endpoint. It's also available for the Mac in preview, so it's not deployed by default or turned on by default, but you can turn it on. And that was episode 108. So if you're interested in how Microsoft does it, we have a whole deep dive on that. But they were able to essentially modify the settings or turn off EDR so that it didn't alert the SOC to the anomalous activity that was going on. Then the threat actor used a third-party VPN service to obfuscate the origin of their activity. I think maybe the first episode we did, Adam, was talking about geolocating or geofencing for IP addresses.
Yep.
And I think this is important because, if you're just using network services and trying to geofence your IP address, in fact, we talked to a customer, maybe not you and me, but I definitely talked to a customer this week where they were like, yeah, our security is solid. We geofence all of our IP addresses. And I was like, okay, well, what happens if your corporate network gets compromised? Now, what happens is that they have access to your resources that are on that network. So, in this case, they used a third-party VPN and then they tailgated into the development environment using the corporate VPN, which was, configured on the corporate laptop. they were able to connect because the computer was connected via domain credentials and MFA. There was no privilege escalation that was identified or required to get into this environment, this development environment. And then from there, they exfiltrated a bunch of data, technical documents, source code, about 200 repositories from the development environment. And they identified that some of the code repositories included clear text, embedded credentials, stored digital certificates, and then some encrypted credentials that are used for production capabilities, such as backup. The encrypted credentials required a separate decryption key, which was not available to this software engineer or threat actor during this incident. But keep that in mind because it'll come in the second incident that happened. During the first one, there was no customer data that was taken, and the cloud-based environments and physical on-prem production environments are separated, both physically and logically. So, that does harp to some of the practices that Adam and I have talked about, where you're keeping the two cloud and on-premise environments separate. So some things were done correctly here, but man, having clear text embedded credentials and other things in the code repository, that is definitely not good. So I'll pause there because this might have been the first time I think you heard all of this, Adam. Wanted to see what your thoughts are on so far.
Real-time reaction, a lot of this mirrors incidents we've heard of before. When I think of SolarWinds, I remember there was tampering with their EDR agent. I believe they had FireEye, and they were able to fly under the radar during some of the early stages of that attack as well. So tamper protection, obviously really important. You mentioned several instances of insecure code or insecure practices where secrets were stored in code. So having some sort of solution to do that monitoring, GitHub Advanced Security is one, to call that out and prevent that behavior is really helpful, as well as just creating a culture where that's not something that's practiced in the environment. And again, all of this we've harped on a lot, Andy, you think to your point, but getting into a VPN should not just be like, wee, I've got everything now. That is bad. I mean, everyone listening knows that's bad. And I get that there's an order of operations to ways we're hardening our environments over time. That is starting to become one, I think, that is becoming a greater and greater risk, where it shouldn't just be, wow, I got a VPN, I'm on the network now. And I can just run amok. That's where having per app VPN or some of these more segmented style connection strategies like a Zscaler work really, really well, where just because they got access to this one thing doesn't mean I can pivot to another thing. And so already we're kind of stacking up lessons learned here and different ways we can start to harden the environment. Any one of these would have helped. None of them are a silver bullet, but the sum of all of these, which organizations are doing, really, really help. And again, I get not everyone's going to be as sophisticated as a Microsoft with 200,000 employees globally, but almost everything on that list, we already do. We have tamper protection, antivirus in our machines. We don't have full on just get to everything VPN, and we use it rarely when we do. And we obviously take pretty seriously the security of code and some of those coding best practices, application security stuff. So it's a practice, and you're just trying to get better over time. So some interesting learnings here for sure. Nothing that's egregious though. Nothing that's not common practice today. There isn't anything here where it's well, gosh, they installed a log me in agent and then had the credentials as default or something open to the public internet. Nothing egregious. And even some of the things that probably would be most interesting aren't documented because the threat actors, like you said, deleted some of the audit logs and ways we could forensically tell what they did. And so that's probably maybe the most interesting part that we don't get to hear about is how they got that initial access on the corporate device. However, nothing egregious, right? And that just kind of shows like why we have to keep upping our game. What was really good a while ago is not so great anymore. And I think that if you're in InfoSec, you have to have that hunger of never being satisfied. Like, this is good for right now. We have to get to the next stage. We have to get to the next place.
And really, one of the things that I took away from this is that this is a very specific targeted attack to LastPass, right? They're obviously a very juicy target, right? And not to say that all the things that we do at Microsoft would have prevented this,
right?
But I mean, like you said, Adam, there's nothing egregious here. Definitely some things that could have been improved that may or may not have prevented it, but we don't know the initial vector of attack. It could have been an email, could have been malware that they downloaded from somewhere, could have been anything. But my assumption is because it was so targeted, it was probably some email or link that was sent directly to LastPass employees, and then they got a foothold in.
Right.
So a couple things that they did to harden the environment after this first incident, and I'm not going to deep dive on any of these because a lot of them are pretty straightforward, but they obviously replaced the laptop that the SE was working on. They also assisted in hardening their home network and personal resources, which is interesting because I think a lot of companies don't think about that. Like, it's one of those things that's kind of, again, bottom of the list, or it gets pushed down. You're like, oh, people are working from home. Maybe we should harden their home networks, because it's not the same as your corporate network. So it's unclear if their home network was compromised as part of this. It could have been. That's also keep in mind for incident 2, because that'll come in. They also deployed some additional EDR solutions to augment the security controls on the engineers' laptops. They did some tuning, some preventive configurations, additional logging. They deployed a secure access service edge, or a SASE solution, to manage direct split tunnel internet access and begin the replacement of VPN access with a zero trust network access solution. Right there, right? I mean, like you talked about it, Adam. Start getting rid of VPN, because once you have VPN and it's a full tunnel access to your corporate network, then it's really easy to pivot to other things versus like an application proxy or a Zscaler where it's a micro VPN tunnel or a SASE solution where you're just getting access to that specific application or resource.
Right.
They purchased new hardware authentication devices for software platform engineers' development use cases. I mean, FIDO2, right?
Right.
We talked about that many, many times. They rotated the LastPass credentials, certificates, security secrets that were known to the threat actor. They updated their WAF, their web application firewall, to heighten monitoring for anomalous activity. They deployed a market-leading cloud security posture management platform to provide additional attack surface visibility, asset, and vulnerability management across the cloud platform. We talk about that all the time, a CSPM. And we did talk about this on our episode for cloud security, which was episode 103. I do want to do a deep dive eventually on CSPM. We won't do that here, but if you have AWS, Azure, GCP, stuff in the cloud, infrastructure in the cloud, you should have a cloud security posture management, at least a basic one, deployed somewhere. They removed any potential for persistent, and to ensure contamination and eradication, they disabled and removed access to the development environment that was compromised. They preserved the artifacts for evidence and then ultimately destroyed the environment. I think this is one of the things that we talk about too, is like, how do you know that the attacker is gone? The only way to really trust is to destroy that, re-image that laptop or do whatever, right? In this case, they destroyed the development environment completely and then rebuilt it from scratch over a 6-week period. And then they deployed some Kubernetes and Docker configuration updates. They removed access to the underlying cloud platform for the engineers and developers. So that to me says that they actually removed, configuration access to, like, say, Azure or AWS for those engineers, and you're just providing them with the ability to, like, do their work within that platform, which is really important, because sometimes those developers are like, oh, I need admin access to, Azure or AWS or whatever. I need this role in order to do this thing. And they restricted or removed that. And then they deployed some canaries within their production and development environments. Canaries are interesting. I don't think a lot of people use them, but they're just there to appear as a juicy target, like an SMB file share or some, spreadsheet that says passwords or something like that. And then as soon as a threat actor accesses that particular canary, it sends a alert. And it's not real data. It's not a real thing. It's just there to kind of lure the threat actor in. So a lot of things they did. I think, a lot of good stuff here. I wish that they would have done it before. We've talked about many of these things on our previous shows.
Sure did get a lot of money for security updates all of a sudden, didn't they? That's always frustrating. It really, really is. I mean, if these are identified needs, and I get we have to run a business here, but man, like, all of a sudden, all this stuff got done. You mentioned the eradication of the entire development environment and rebuilding that. I mean, that's impressive. I have been really anti, like, trying to repair or clean machines for years. I've always subscribed to the philosophy of nuke it from orbit. It's the only way to be sure, like paraphrasing from Alien or Aliens, whichever one it was. I don't like trying to clean something. Like, you just don't know. You just got to flatten it and repave it. So that's very aggressive, but kind of awesome. Like, good for them. And we did an episode several weeks ago about operational excellence, and we were kind of riffing off of a Swift on Security tweet talking about, if you can't rebuild PCs in your environment in minutes, then not only does that help you with security, that helps you with other potential operational issues that aren't necessarily security related, but there's security benefits from being able to do it. And so I think of stuff like that, like the fact that they could, even though it said they took 6 weeks, like, that's still pretty fast. I think that's kind of awesome. They obviously had some pretty good operational excellence around how they ran their dev environment. So that's kind of cool. This is actually more of a response than I expected, which makes kind of the lingering story that there's going to be a second incident, it's much worse, really interesting, because they did a lot of stuff here. Like, this is pretty good. I'm sure not all this was done and fully operationalized, even if it was deployed. And we as security professionals know there's quite a distinction between the two, but very, very interesting how much they got done in a pretty short period of time. And honestly, an impressive effort. Really, really good.
Yeah, I think that the time frame of deploying some of these tools and maybe updating the blog, I don't think they got it all done before the second incident, because what happened was, during the forensic investigation, they discovered that the first incident ended when they detected the activity on the corporate laptop, and then the attacker was still in the environment until October 26, 2022. And so they used the information that they exfiltrated from the first incident. They were able to stay on the network, identify people, do some reconnaissance of, other engineers or titles that they might be able to target, and they pivoted. And so what they discovered was the alerting and logging was enabled during the second incident, but it wasn't immediately indicating anomalous behavior, because specifically, and I think we've talked about this before, Adam, the threat actor was able to leverage valid credentials stolen for a senior DevOps engineer to access a shared cloud storage environment, which made it difficult for investigators to differentiate between the threat actor activity and ongoing legitimate activity. So, I mean, this is one of the most difficult things when it comes to attacks, is when credentials are stolen, the user who ultimately has legitimate access to the resource may still be logging in, doing things that they need to, while the threat actor is just kind of, in the background, and that activity is actually hidden because it looks like legitimate access. And our tools just aren't very good at detecting legitimate access that might be malicious. That's just I think in general, it's a very difficult thing. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, their AWS guard duty alerts informed them that there was a threat actor because the threat actor attempted to use the cloud IAM role to perform unauthorized activity. So to access these S3 buckets that have this vault data, they needed the decryption keys. And if you remember in the first attack, when they exported all that stuff, they didn't actually have access to the encryption keys or the decryption keys for the encrypted data. And what LastPass disclosed to us was that there were only two places that the decryption keys were stored. Number one, in a segregated and secure implementation of an orchestration platform and key value store used to coordinate backups of the LastPass development and production environments with various cloud-based storage resources. Now, that's obviously really difficult to get into. The second one, however, was a highly restricted set of shared folders in a LastPass password manager vault that were used by DevOps engineers to perform admin duties in those environments. Now, they disclosed that there were actually only 4 DevOps engineers with the keys to the kingdom that had access to these decryption keys. And what this threat actor did was actually target one of them at home. So it turns out this home engineer had their corporate LastPass vault signed into on a non-managed home computer. And the threat actor was able to use and exploit a vulnerability in a third-party media software package, which enabled remote code execution capabilities that allowed them to implant a keylogger malware. And then as the employee was typing in their master password, it was captured. And after they authenticated with MFA, and they were able to gain access to the LastPass corporate vault for this DevOps engineer. Now, that is one complicated but very targeted attack. And it was actually reported in the media that the vulnerable software was Plex. And many people run Plex servers. And in fact, many people allow their Plex servers to be available over the internet. I have a Plex server. However, I keep it internal to my network. I don't actually allow externally because I know there's threat actors who look at that. And I also check it often for updates. And if you're just sitting at home watching, you may not log into your Plex server and see that there's an update. Now it will actually tell you, fortunately, in whatever format you're playing it in. Like I have it on Apple TV, I have it on my iPhone. Now when you actually log into the Plex app, it'll say, hey, there is an update for the server. It used to not do that. You used to have to actually go in through the browser to look at that. But now it does that. So really nice. Sounds like, this DevOps engineer wasn't updating his Plex server. He probably had external capabilities enabled, and they were able to take advantage of that. So they were able to export the vault entries and the contents of the shared folder. I'm pretty sure, it's been a while since I've been a LastPass admin in a corporate environment, but I'm pretty sure you can actually have a setting to prevent exports of any shared folder. But in this case, this highly restricted one with the keys to the kingdom, they were able to export it. Now, maybe he just copy and pasted or something like that from the, with access to the corporate vault. Maybe he did it that way. It doesn't actually say how he exported it, but there is a setting, I'm pretty sure, where you can just prevent things from getting exported. And so that's how he got access to the S3 bucket, and in there was production backups, which is what ultimately was stolen, and all in the news. We did a whole episode on that. Now, there are 2 different ways to implement corporate LastPass, and this may also be something for other corporate password managers like Bitwarden or 1Password. You can implement it using a master password, which then is managed through LastPass and is only for LastPass. There's benefits to that because it's a separate password from your corporate password. And, if your corporate identity gets compromised, then they wouldn't hopefully have access to to your vault. But in this case, you can see that they still might be able to get access to it. The other way is SAML authentication, like through your IDP. So single sign-on, there's benefits to that for usability for the user. They don't have to remember another password. And you can implement, most importantly, a device management solution that force compliance checks and configurations. So you get single sign-on. You can do conditional access for MFA. You can force it to only be on a compliant device. So I think in this case, LastPass probably didn't have it. They had a separate master password. And they were able to compromise it that way. So obviously it was on a home computer and there was no device management deployed for that.
Wow. I mean, that's impressive, right? I mean, that is, you have to understand, obviously the threat actor had a significant amount of reconnaissance to understand where stuff was, who had access to it, and all of that. There's a lot here that had to happen for them to have the line of sight to know where to go and what to do. And then to make a plan to execute it. I mean, the plan's super impressive. How they even found the home computer, port scanned it, found Plex running. Wow. I mean, that's a targeted attack for you. And that's why they're so hard to stop. And I think you're right. I mean, ultimately here, like you talked about early on, if the logging of those legitimate accounts being used in illegitimate ways had highlighted that better, they potentially could have caught that earlier. And that is one of the biggest challenges in information security today, because most attacks remain identity attacks at their core. I'm going to take over an identity that is privileged to do something and then go do a thing. And how do you call that out? How do you see that? And it's something we're all still working on and we're all trying to get better at. But I think this is where organizations do need to be less wound up about, 0 days and these really theoretical attacks. And again, if somebody took over an account, how do we know? How do we have visibility into it? What is giving us a behavioral baseline of activity and alerting when something is anomalous to that? And part of what you have to do here to be able to really make heads and tails of that is be relentless with making your logging valuable, improving your signal to noise ratio, whether that's having a SIM that does some of that for you, automatic incident correlation, highlighting alerts that are higher fidelity or potentially more relevant or potentially more dangerous, or whatever the case may be. It's a multi-pronged effort to get better at this, but it's something we have to do. You go all the way back to the big Target breach many years ago. Target logged everything. It was all there. They didn't see it. The signal to noise ratio was too poor. So if you have noisy alerts and you have to dismiss a whole bunch of them to get to the good stuff, you got to find a way to automate that. You have to find a way to surface the most meaningful alerts and let you take action on them. And then doing everything you can with identity to flag legitimate anomalous activity. This person signed in from a weird IP address. They signed in at a weird time of day. They're using a different workstation. They're using a different internet service provider. If any of those sign-in characteristics are different, that should be flagged and potentially even blocked, depending on how much it's divergent from their normal use case. And these are things we just got to get better at. And some of this is available and some of this is still pretty early day. I don't think anybody's got all of this figured out, but you got to get better at all of these things to start to have a chance to find that needle in the haystack. And so again, kind of I said with the first part of it, nothing egregious here, nothing so crazy, not a great idea, just a bunch of little things that could be better that stack up and make a path for, again, a very targeted attack, to be clear. This was obviously human-driven from the get-go. And for good reason, it's an incredibly attractive target. So that's really interesting to me. I think, too, just, you're right, it's a piling on at this point. Maybe don't allow access from home devices at all. But you can argue, like, perhaps from their home PC, they were doing some sort of remote desktop. A keylogger would still capture that keystroke going across. So, you know, that even if you're like, we make everyone sign in with a Azure Bastion host or a Windows 365 cloud PC or insert third-party solution here to get to corporate resources, that still would have worked in this case. They still could have stolen those creds. So, you know, you can definitely limit and restrict the ability of being able to work from non-managed devices. But I think everyone wants to find a way to say yes. And here's where you do give some credence to the tinfoil hat guys who don't want to do that, or gals. And again, I mean, that's where you balance like the super targeted attack versus like normal. It's pretty uncommon for somebody to like, I'm going to go compromise your home PC and install keylogger on it so I can steal your corporate creds because I know you've been signing in from home. That's really targeted, really unusual. I'd say the overwhelming majority of information security incidents don't involve something to that level. So while at the same time, I'm all for it, learn from this stuff and do better, at the same time, there's a part of me that says, this is super attractive target. This is a super isolated case. And sometimes we don't need to overreact and be like, you can never work from any device that's not a company managed device. Because for the most part, a virtual desktop type approach does reduce, if not eliminate, the overwhelming majority of risk there. But in this use case, it actually went in assault for it. So that's interesting to me, where something that's considered a really good practice still would not have been enough. But again, really, 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 really dedicated attacker.
And we've talked about this before, but it's the level of access that you have, right? Like normal information worker probably don't need to overreact and, you know, try to implement a bunch of security things. But a senior DevOps engineer with the keys to the kingdom probably should only be accessing that from a PAM, right?
Right.
Or I'm sorry, a PAW or a SAW, right? So like Microsoft allows you and me to have access to corporate resources on personal machines that are InTune managed. But I bet if we were admins in the environment with some sort of thing, like that would not be okay.
Right.
So
true.
So they did do a couple of steps to harden after this as well. I'll go through these quickly because I think most of it is pretty straightforward. They, again, assisted the DevOps engineer with hardening the security of their home network and personal resources, which I found that's great. We need to think about that because there are vulnerabilities. You know, how often do most people update their firmware on their routers and all of that, right? They enabled Microsoft's conditional access pin matching MFA using an upgrade to the MFA application, which became GA during the incident. Obviously, Adam and I have talked about that a lot. That is GA now. Definitely go and implement that. They rotated critical and high privilege credentials that were known to the threat actor, and they continue to rotate other lower priority items. They revoked and reissued certificates. They analyzed the AWS S3 storage resources and applied a bunch of hardening things there. I do want to say, you know, as far as that goes, there's a ton there that they went through. We don't have to do a deep dive on AWS S3 bucket security, but one of the things that I found interesting, and this is coming if you're an AWS customer, is that all newly created S3 buckets starting in April of this year are going to have block public access enabled by default as well as ACLs disabled. Both are console defaults. Both have been long practices, but now they're just going to be implemented by default, which is great because that will reduce, you know, it's like the tyranny of the default, right? Like most customers create an S3 bucket and then it has, you know, public access enabled by default. It's like, come on, man. So now it's going to be disabled by default. Azure Blob, which is kind of the equivalent of AWS S3 buckets, have had public access disabled for a long time. So that is the default if you're using Azure storage. So one of the things that really came to mind about this, and Adam, you mentioned it, which is like, don't allow corporate resources on home computers. And that really comes down to like compliant devices and enrolling in device management. Obviously at Microsoft, we use InTune. If the access to the corporate vault was onboarded with SAML authentication, then you can apply conditional access to it to say only allow access to the LastPass corporate resource on a compliant device, which means that they have to be enrolled with compliance checking. A lot of people use third-party IDPs. A lot of customers use Okta. So I just went and checked the Okta device trust documentation because I was curious if anything had been updated in the last almost 2 years now since I've been an Okta admin. And unfortunately, not much has been updated. So for Okta, they're still only allowing device trust, which is their compliance, right? Like you have to be on a quote unquote trusted device in order to access an Okta resource. For Windows, it's only domain joined machines, which you have to upload a certificate that's from your domain controller into it, and then it checks to see if that certificate is there. If it's there, then it assumes that it's a trusted device, and then you can access Okta resources. Maybe if they're assuming that if you're using Azure Active Directory joined machines, that you're using InTune to manage that, but that only will work if the device access like Microsoft 365 resources, because most likely your other cloud apps are onboarded with Okta and it won't be able to check. So this is really a really important distinction for security, because if you're using a third-party IDP, the only way you can limit it is really by IP. There's no other way, because Okta or Ping, they don't have the device compliance built into their solutions. They have these device trust things, but it's offloading the compliance to your MDM provider. It just says, hey, are you enrolled in some sort of MDM solution? Yes. Then we assume that that is doing the compliance checking for us. It doesn't do any real-time attestation of that device, which means, if you don't do anything, like if I have an Okta or Ping onboarded SaaS app, I can just sign into it. Okay, make sure that you have MFA enabled. Great. Okay. Well, that wouldn't have prevented this attack because they had a keylogger and it was already MFA like authenticated. Like that's the only defense you have. Either limit it by IP and put in the corporate IPs, which again, we know the downfalls of that, and then require MFA. There's a lot of MFA attacks now. So, that's pretty much it. If they have a valid identity, they can sign in. The only way to prevent something like this is compliant devices, which again, like Okta has. You can do it for Windows domain joined machines. You can do it for Macs with Jamf. iOS and Android works with like AirWatch, InTune, and Mobile Iron. But you're offloading that compliance to that MDM solution. And all it does is say, are you enrolled in this? Good. Okay. Now you can access the application. They assume that the MDM is doing the compliance checking, which is about the same as the conditional access for hybrid Azure AD join devices. We talk about like moving your devices to hybrid Azure AD join because then you can apply conditional access. There is a conditional access that says, is this device hybrid Azure AD joined? Is it? If it is, allow access. Well, okay. I mean, that doesn't really check the compliance of anything. Like we assume if you're doing hybrid Azure AD join, you're probably allowing SCCM to do that compliance check, or maybe you're doing co-management and you slid that bar over to InTune for the compliance check, but it's still using something else to do the compliance check. And all it is just checking, okay, is this enrolled? It is. Now you have access. So I won't like go down the rabbit hole of InTune because we're going to do another episode on some of the InTune advanced capabilities. Mm-hmm. But just know that this is something that is really, for me, I like to get on my soapbox because third-party IDPs, they're great, but they're very, very limiting. Like, I truly believe like using Azure Active Directory for your SaaS apps to integrate with MDM, InTune, is the best way to secure your environment. Like, you can do a third-party EDR. I don't care. Like, you want to get CrowdStrike, you want to get Mimecast or Proofpoint, cool. But identity, which we've seen over and over again as the main vector of attack, to be able to integrate that with device compliance is key to securing your environment.
I love it. Andy on his soapbox. Normally I'm on my soapbox, so this is awesome. Totally agree, of course, with everything you said. And honestly, like I'm not here to pick on some of the other really good identity solutions because they're very good. But this is a miss, and I don't understand if there's some sort of technical challenges with getting it better. I don't know why there can't be some sort of partnership that shares like API status. Like, I'm going to query this API when they sign in and check what the status of it is. It's mind-boggling to me, because having those two things linked together, is your identity valid? Doing a whole bunch of checks on identity. Is anything anomalous about this sign-in? Combined with, what's the health of this device right now? Not, did you do this a long time ago, but what's the status right now? Are you patched? Are you under threat from the EDR solution? Are you on the proper operating system version? Do you have these security controls enabled? And if none of those, or if any of those fail, you can't get to your stuff. You can't get to secure information like email or SharePoint or whatever, third-party application, Workday. I know, actually a common attack, not a common attack, but a clever attack I heard a while ago, I've probably shared this on the show before, was Workday accounts were getting compromised, and then people were signing in and changing the direct deposit to a different bank account and stealing people's paychecks, which is like, that's really clever. Anyhow, having this sort of control in place, it hardens that automatically. And so we'll do another episode on it, to your point, Andy, but gosh, this is something you only get with that Microsoft solution of InTune plus Azure Active Directory. Nobody else has this in the same way that platform does, and that's across iOS, macOS, Android, Windows. So any major platform you can support, and Linux too, right? And do these kinds of controls. And they're significant, and they block all sorts of attacks. Like, we did a show on Evil Jinx forever ago, that machine in the middle, adversary in the middle attack to steal access tokens. This stops that. Won't work if you do this. So anyhow, I love that you're on your soapbox on this one, and you're absolutely right. So let's talk about that more in a future show.
Yeah, and to be clear, you can use InTune with third-party IDPs. Mm-hmm. It'll absolutely work. But you can only really do it with Microsoft 365 apps. So if I'm an Okta customer and I want to get to my corporate email, yeah, then you can trigger conditional access with InTune to enroll that. However, if you have other SaaS apps, and that's like the important thing here, is like if I wanted to go to my GitHub that's not integrated with Azure Active Directory, or if I want to get to Dropbox or some other SaaS app, right? Development in AWS that's Okta enabled or Ping enabled, then you can't implement conditional access and enroll that device and force it to be a compliant device as long as they have MFA. Here you go on a non-compliant device. So that is the biggest security risk that I see. And yeah, I get pretty fired up about it because it is something that I truly believe in. Mm-hmm. And it works. So
yeah, pretty seamlessly too.
And that's our show for this week. Thanks for listening and watching. As always, our contact information will be in the show notes if you have any questions or topics you want us to talk about in the future. Thanks. We'll talk to you guys next week.
Thank you for listening to the Blue Security Podcast. Please check out the show notes, catch up on episodes you may have missed, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. Find Andy on Twitter @AJaw0 and Adam @AJ Brewer. See you at our next episode.